the certainty that he could know being and the course of the world. What holds for Kant's destruction of the ancient notion of being holds stronger measure for his new concept of man's freedom, a new concept in which, oddly enough, the modern lack of freedom is indicated. Man has the possibility of determining his own actions out of the freedom of the good will. These actions themselves, however, fall under the causality of nature, a sphere essentially alien to man. Herein expressed the contradictory structure of his human reality, so far as displays its role in the world. While Kant made man the master and the measure of man, at the same time he lowered him to a slave of being. Since Kant every philosophy maintains an element of defiance on the one hand and open or concealed concept of faith, even Marx, who nevertheless, as he himself explained, wished no longer to interpret the world, but to change it, and therefore stood on the crest of a new concept of being and the world, in which being and the world are no longer recognized as only given, but as a possible product of man. Quickly fled back to the old security when he agreed with Hegel that freedom is insight into necessity.
When Schelling desired to have the real master of being, he wished again to participate in the movement of the world, from which, since Kant, the free man had been excluded. Schelling flees again to a philosophic God, precisely because he accepts from Kant the fact of decline, without, however, making use of Kant's extraordinary calmness in simply coming to terms with it.
For Kant's tranquility, which seems so imposing to us, is in the end due only to the fact that he was strongly rooted in the tradition that philosophy is essentially identical with contemplation. Kant himself unconsciously destroyed. The reason why Schelling is usually overlooked in discussion of existing philosophy is that no philosopher has taken his part towards the solution of Kant's difficulties concerning subjective freedom and objective necessity. A positive philosophy is to reinterpret man in order to that he might enter again into this world that robs him of value. His failure was to belong to his being and not merely to be his fate, was the due not to nature hostile to him because it was completely determined by causal law, was already to be traced in his own nature.
Hence, Kant's concept of human freedom and dignity, as well as of humanity, as the regulative principle of all political action, were abandoned, and there arose that distinctive melancholy which, since Kierkegaard, has been the hallmark of all except the most superficial philosophy.
The birth of the self. Modern existence philosophy begins with Kierkegaard. The individual finds himself in the permanent contradiction to this explained world, since his existence, namely the pure factual character of his existing, in all its contingency, that precisely I am I, and no one else, and that precisely I am, rather than am not, can be neither foreseen by reason nor resolved into something purely unthinkable. But this existence which I am continually, but momentarily, and which I cannot grasp by reason, is the only thing which I can be unquestionably certain. Thus, man's task is to become subjective, a consciously existing being who perpetually realizes the paradoxical implication of his life in the world. The universal structure of human reality is characteristic of all existence philosophy, that by existential, it fundamentally understands what Kierkegaard had presented in the category of exception. The existential attitude turns about the realizing, the imposition to that which is only contemplated, of the most universal structure of life.
Anxiety, subjectivity. The passion to become subjective flares up in Kierkegaard with the realized anxiety before death as the event in which alone am guaranteed as an individual, separated from average everyday life. The thought of death becomes an action, since in it man makes himself subjective, withdraws from the world and from everyday life with other men.
Kierkegaard and Heidegger after him have always interpreted death as the peculiar objection against the being of man, as proof of his nothingness, in which possibly Heidegger's analysis of death and the character of human life bound up with the surpasses that Kierkegaard on contingency and precision. On these presumptions rests not only modern inwardness, but also the fanatical resoluteness which enters likewise in Kierkegaard to seize earnestly the moment, since only the moment is existence, namely reality. Now it is clear that Kierkegaard's peculiar inner activity is becoming subjective, immediately leads us out of philosophy. It goes with philosophy only so far as a philosophic grounds for the philosopher's revolt against philosophy must be found. Similarly, thought and directly opposite pole lies at the case of Marx, who likewise explained philosophically that man can change the world, and thus should cease to interpret it.
Kierkegaard has become so much the more important for the later development of philosophy. Philosophy has taken over from him its new concrete contents. That as guarantee of the principium individuationis, since death as the most common of occurrences, nevertheless strikes me unavoidably alone. Contingency as guarantee of reality as only given, which overwhelms and persuades precisely through its incalculability and irreducibility to thought. Guilt as the category of all human activity, which is wreaked not upon the world but upon itself, in so far as always take responsibilities upon self which cannot overlook, and compelled through decisions themselves to neglect other activity. Guilt is thus the mode and the mother in which self become real, plunged into reality.
Extreme situations. Man is placed because the contradictory structure of his man reality, and which give him his proper impulse to philosophize. Jaspers himself seeks to found a new kind of philosophy on the basis of these situations, and he adds the content he has taken over from Kierkegaard, something further, which is now called struggle, now love, but which later becomes, in this theory of communication, the new form of philosophic intelligence.
Heidegger's attempt, despite and against Kant, to re-establish an ontology led to a far-reaching alteration of the traditional philosophical terminology. For this reason, Heidegger always appears on first glance more revolutionary than Jaspers. In this terminological appearance has very much interfered with the correct estimate of his philosophy.
To the question concerning the meaning of being, he is given the propositional answer, in itself unintelligible, that the meaning of being is temporality. With his analysis of human reality, the being of man, which is conditioned by death, he established that the meaning of being is nothingness. Thus, Heidegger's attempt to find new foundation of metaphysics ends consistently not with the second promised volume, which has determined the meaning of being generally on the basis of the analysis of human being, but with a small brochure, What is Metaphysics?, in which it is quite consistently shown, despite all tricks and sophistries of speech, that being in the Heideggerian sense is the nothing.
Master of Being. If we look at the problem of the nothing in our context of a philosophy revolting against philosophy as pure contemplation, then we see it as an effort to become master of being, thereby to question philosophically in such a manner that we progress immediately to the deed. Thus, the thought that being is really the nothing has a tremendous advantage. Basing himself on this, man can imagine himself, can relate himself to being that is given, no less than the Creator before the creation of the world, which, as we know, was created out of nothing.
The being of man, Dasein, existence. Heidegger maintains that he has found a being in whom essence and existence are immediately identical, and this is man. His essence is his existence. The substance of man is not mind, but existence. Man has no substance. The important thing is that he is. One cannot ask after the what of a thing, but only after his who. Man as the identity of existence and essence appeared to give a new key to the question concerning being in general.
The being of man, Heidegger calls existence or Dasein. Through establish this terminology, he gets away from using the expression man. This is not arbitrary terminology. Its purpose is to resolve man into a series of modes of being